The project Coastal Highway Route E39 is exploring the technological challenges and social impacts of establishing a ferry-free road connection between Kristiansand and Trondheim. The E39 extends for nearly 1,100 kilometers through 6 countries and across 8 fjords, which today must be crossed by ferry. There is a political desire for permanent links across these fjords. The fjord crossings are at the core of a ferry-free E39. Crossing these fjords will require technological advances. The less complicated fjord crossings have already been built. It is the extreme fjord crossings that remain. The Norwegian Public Roads Administration has launched a technological development project to assess the requirements for crossing the wide fjords of Western Norway and the types of crossings that could be considered. In this project, we're building on the expertise of the offshore industry. The Norwegian oil industry has developed huge installations, both fixed and floating, for use offshore in increasingly deep waters. The Sognefjord provides a prime example of the challenges represented by the fjords. If the Sognefjord can be spanned on a stretch between Lavik and Oppidal, spans can also be built across the other fjords. Because of its width and depth, we need to consider the fjord as a way of joining the 2 banks, rather than viewing it as a barrier. Here the fjord is 3.7 kilometers wide and 1,300 meters deep. A bridge across the Sognefjord will be significantly longer than any similar existing structures. To allow unhindered passage for ships in the Sognefjord, we need a shipping lane that is at least 400 meters wide, 70 meters high and 20 meters deep. 5 different bridge designs are being considered. A suspension bridge is perhaps the most traditional solution. A suspension bridge across the Sognefjord would have a main span of 3,700 meters. This is nearly 3 times the length of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and double the current world record length. The 2 bridge towers would reach a height of 450 meters, which is 150 meters taller than the Eiffel Tower. Another alternative is a floating bridge, anchored at each end. Today, the Nordhordland Bridge is the world's longest bridge of this type. The floating section of a bridge across the Sognefjord would be 3 times longer than that of the Nordhordland Bridge. The Sognefjord is too deep for lateral anchoring with traditional methods, and achieving sufficient rigidity is a challenge for a bridge that can only be anchored at both ends. Raising a floating bridge high enough to allow ships to pass underneath is another challenging task. A submerged floating tunnel is a new type of crossing that has never been built. A submerged floating tunnel consists of 1 or 2 concrete tubes that are submerged in the fjord, floating approximately 20 meters below the surface. Anchored at these depths poses a challenge for this type of structure. One solution would be to have anchoring points at both ends and floating pontoons on the surface. The tube would enter the bedrock beneath the surface on each end of the fjord. Motorists would have the same experience driving in a submerged floating tunnel as in any other concrete tunnel. A submerged floating tunnel extending over 3.7 kilometers would entail strict safety requirements. These could be addressed by constructing 2 tubes that are connected at regular intervals. or building one large tube with two separate carriageways. A submerged floating tunnel can also be combined with a floating bridge. No structure of this type has ever been built. Such a structure across the Sonnefjord would consist of approximately 1.2 kilometers of submerged floating tunnel and 2.5 kilometers of floating bridge. Using this design, the shipping lane would pass above the submerged floating tunnel, providing unrestricted sailing height. A traditional cable-stayed bridge may be a further alternative, but with the towers built on floating elements. This idea is taken from the offshore industry, where large platforms are anchored in deep water in the same manner. However, this has never been attempted for bridges. In addition to the two towers at each end, there would be 4 towers at intervals along the bridge, placed on floating elements anchored to the bottom of the fjord. A bridge spanning the Sonnefjord may be technically possible within a few years. Whether it will be built remains a political question. In any event, several of the solutions that are shown here could also be used for other fjord crossings across the E39 and elsewhere in Norway.